I live in the Carolinas, and there are plenty of swamplands around here. You can't avoid them, but if you grew up around here, you know the rules, and don't go anywhere near them without being covered in bug spray. And watch out for snakes and alligators. But what if I told you I saw something down there once, which made me think I'd take 100 mosey bites instead? Let me tell you about it. You see, I was driving back from work one night when I noticed the car started pulling, and I realized I had a flat. I pulled over and checked. Sure enough, one of the front wheels was flapping. I work in a bar, and sometimes the patrons get a little feisty. Must have been a fight outside, and some glass didn't get picked up, and of course I had to drive over it. Now, I know you're always meant to carry a spare. It was one of around 1 million things I had on my to-do list, which hadn't yet gotten done. So now, I'm stuck on the side of the road. Of course near the swamps, because I couldn't have broken down in town with all the streetlights and people around. So I'm trying to decide whether to call AAA or a buddy to come help out. And that's right when I hear this strange noise. Of course, being near swampland in the evening, there are all sorts of noises. Creatures that live in there go about their business. But this sounded different. At first, I thought maybe somebody was just passing by. That someone had seen my car and pulled over further down the road, which I'd somehow missed, and now they were coming to help. Because that was what it sounded like. Footsteps. Wet footsteps. Like maybe somebody had been wading through water. I looked down the street both ways, but surprisingly, I couldn't see whoever was making the noise. But that was because I was obviously looking at the road. When I turned back toward the swamp, I saw exactly who, or more accurately what, was making the noise. It looked like a lizard. But not a regular lizard. That would have been too normal. But never fear, because this lizard was humanoid-like. I didn't know that at the time. I just stood there, with my mouth hanging open, doing all the usual things like pinching myself, rubbing my eyes to see if I was truly dreaming. I was unfortunately very much awake, staring at what I can only say is this lizard man, or what I thought of him until I got home and tried to do some research. The best way for me to describe him is that he kind of looked a bit like an alligator, with 2 human-like legs, only with a much thinner body and long legs. It's actually quite hard for me to accurately describe. I guess because my mind wants desperately to try and make sense of what my eyes were seeing. Yeah, he looked really tall, easily like a regular person, but was very thick and scaly, really powerful looking arms and legs. His head was just like an actual lizard or alligator. Long jaws with large teeth and a snout, eyes that bugged out on the sides of his face. He was just slowly wading through the swamp water, heading right for me in my direction. Now, I'm going to go ahead and hazard that guess that they don't teach shop or mechanics to lizard people, so I can only think that this thing was going to hurt me. So I grabbed my phone and keys, and I ran, as far away from the swamp and my car as possible, until I got to the safety of some houses and streetlights about a mile or so down the road. Then, I called one of my friends to come pick me up. Now, he is a lot braver, or more stupid. Then, he drives back with a huge pickup truck. When I told him what I'd seen, he immediately wanted to go back and check it out. The shotgun he had in the back made me feel braver, but still, there was the risk. We headed back to my car, which was still exactly where I'd left it. so I guess this lizard dude wasn't into stealing my vehicle. My friend Nate jumps out of the pickup, shotgun in hand, and starts shouting and hollering. But of course we don't see anything. I have no idea exactly what that thing was or what it intended to do. All I knew was I didn't want to hang about and find out. But as I said, once I was feeling a bit braver, I looked, and not only did I find your channel, I found a lot of similar disturbing sightings. So it seems lizard men or alligator men gets around. And apparently, judging from your other encounters, there's a whole family of them living around here in the swamps in southeastern America. There are some things your mom tells you that you should really listen to. Of course, when we are kids, we always think that we know best. But listen, there's often a reason why they tell you not to do certain things, but we usually end up finding them out the hard way. For example, my mother told us kids not to play in the stream at the bottom of the field because it was dirty and boggy, and you never know what you might find or catch in there. It was like telling us kids not to eat sweets because they'd rot your teeth out. Like a moth to a flame, we were drawn to the stream even more after being warned. So, one day, after a particularly rainy night, my little brother and I headed straight to the stream, knowing it would be overflowing, thus even more enticing. We played with sticks, trying to find newts, made newspaper boats, and did all of the things that any child would do near a stream. We pulled up our joggers and stomped in the muddy water, and that was when we saw the ripples. Ripples meant air, which meant something was living in there rather than just the water and flies we had seen so far. This made us excited. Now, I have no idea what to be expected in the muddy, boggy stream, but what came out of the water would blow our tiny 8 to 10-year-old minds. It, or he, or they, must have been laying low on the ground under the stream, as when it stood up and rose from the water, there was no way he could have possibly been covered by that level of water otherwise. It was around our height, so about 4 feet or so, and looked like something straight out of a comic book. Covered in greenish scales, weird fins and gills. He kind of had a squat body and long bowed legs, and thin arms and webbed hands and feet. I'm not trying to be mean. It was very amphibious looking, and it was kind of funny, but also frightening. Rising out of the stream was this creature, only he wasn't so little to us at the time, since he was around our size. My brother and I were caught between fear and excitement. Our mouths were wide open. It's not exactly what you would expect to see. I'd like to say that we weren't scared, but we were both terrified. We did not expect to see anything like that. He sort of just looked at us, unamused, then turned around and jolted off. We ran all the way home and didn't stop until we were back inside the kitchen with my mom, who just looked at us as if to say, "See, I told you not to go into the stream." It's like deep down she knew we shouldn't have been there, and that maybe there was more dangerous things than what we could have thought. Of course now, this was so many years ago, but as an adult, it's fun to think back and realize that there are animals that exist that go beyond the realm of our imagination. I don't believe in Bigfoot, but I certainly do believe in undiscovered species of animals. As far as an explanation for what me and my brother saw, well, I have no idea what animal that was. People have asked me before if you ever really get used to living in Gator country. I don't exactly know how to answer them. It's like asking if you ever get used to living around a hornet's nest. Sure, the sights and sounds will grow on you, but if you get stung, you get stung, and it doesn't hurt any less if you've seen them once a week or once an hour. So it is with gators. You get eaten, you die, no matter how used you are to seeing them. I've been living in gator country for my 45 years, and I haven't lost any arms or legs yet. I do think I have lost some nerves with some close encounters I've had, and one in particular stands out, since I'm not sure if I can really blame the gators for it. I had just enough southern comfort to make me braver than I should have been, and when I get brave, I like to go exploring. I want to take the canoe, the lantern if I need it, and go looking around. I know what a gator looks like, especially when it's trying to pretend to be a drifting log, and no amount of drink can blind me to it. It's a sight that I know by heart. But I came across something entirely new, really. It's a miracle that it did not cost me my life, since I went in to greet death, eyes wide open. So I'm out there exploring, driven by curiosity, fanned by the flame of a good buzz. The passages I could row down were getting narrower and narrower, and the reeds were growing closer together. I came to a clearing where I swear I saw what looked like tall green pineapples growing up out of the water. They had the same overall shape and texture, except that they had something like scales on the outside, and the whole lot of things would twitch and bounce in a while. There was also the occasional burp sound, indicating the expulsion of either air or fluids. If I had been smart or sober, I would have hightailed it back home, but I wasn't sober. Like a big kid that had just discovered big pine cones, I had to see what sort of secrets those big scaly green things held. My knife was barely any good on them. I could get the blade under a scale and peel it off without great effort, but that was it. The things were well armored. I was able to comprehend well enough that it was some sort of egg or embryo, but I didn't reflect long enough on what sort of thing made them, and whether said thing would be nearby to protect the brood. At first, I thought it was a gator rearing up to attack me. Then I thought the whiskey might have been spiked with something stronger than just alcohol, because I saw what could have passed as a gator walking on its two back legs, keeping its balance just fine and holding its body upright with the grace of a cobra. The head, though, was shorter than your usual gators, and the eyes were larger. The mouth also hung open a bit, and all the teeth you'd ever expect to see were there. But there was an alertness, an intelligence in those eyes that I'd never seen in any gator's eyes. It must have been Mama, and she was not thrilled to see me. I took out my dad's revolver, which was empty, and aimed it at my attacker. And she, or it, seemed to understand immediately, freezing in place. I abandoned my phone that I had just dropped in the water, and I ran. The last thing I remember was somebody calling my name from far away. After that, I blacked out. Apparently, my wife had come back looking for me when I didn't show up at nightfall. They had pretty much been on my heels when I was busy, tussling with my scaly little friend. I can't think of any other explanations as to why I'm still here. Whatever that thing was that lived in the swamp surely would have eaten me alive if it had just been me and her. I've never seen an alligator like that before, nor do I know exactly what it was. I feel weird for even using the term alligator. While it resembled an alligator, a lot of its defining features were very human-like. So was it an alligator man, dare I say? I don't know. And its eggs. I found its eggs or embryos. Either way, I'm very disturbed, and hopefully this information will do better to you than it will to me. I was a part of a research expedition in the Amazon rainforest. We were looking for some indications that some plants could cure modern diseases. It's another big secret that the worldwide medical system needs all the help it can get. The locals had directed us to an especially dense grove of trees that produced these small, strange yellow fruits. And no, not lemons. When taken back for research, it was found that early-stage cancer cells dried up immediately by substances and proteins found within this particular fruit. Just to say, my superiors were eager to get their hands, and on only these fruits, but also on seeds of this particular tree, so they could look into propagating them in a controlled environment as soon as possible. The natives had warned that not too much of the fruit should leave the grove at any given time. Otherwise, the forest would be angry. We thought that was a joke. Well, I was hoping that 3 small crates would not be considered greedy by the forest. I was nailing the last lid on the crate when we all heard a blood-chilling howl. Staring in between the trees were sets of large compound eyes that shifted colors, primarily between green and yellow. They were set in faces that were mostly olive green, with some molted gray and brown. At first, I made them out to be people that were covered in a great deal of war paint. Makes sense. Maybe we had disturbed the territory of some uncontacted Amazonian tribe. But then I saw that they weren't people at all. I saw teeth, like shark teeth, and lots of thick scales, claws that resembled meat hooks, faces that ranged from every structure resembling to a Komodo dragon to even modern crocodiles. I don't think I've ever ran so fast in my life. My veins were on fire, and my heart felt like it would have stopped at any minute. After a very long time, I looked behind me to see that the creatures were not pursuing me. I tried to find my way back to that grove, and I never could. The expedition was considered a large-scale failure, and before we could leave the country, we were greeted by a Brazilian military who confiscated our 3 crates and took the expedition leader and nearly detained him before giving him a good talking. We were told and demanded to leave the country as soon as we could and to never return. I'm not exactly sure why it was necessary for the Brazilian military to get involved, or why they felt it was necessary to confiscate the fruit and threaten us and demand we leave. Something is going on. I believe they knew something was up with that grove, and the warnings we had received prior about that same grove were probably in hopes that we would never venture to there. Who knows what we were not supposed to see that we had seen. I had taken a long fishing trip to a more isolated region of Alaska. Granted, every part of Alaska is considered isolated. A lot of places you can only reach by airplane. Where I was at was isolated, even by the standards of Alaskan natives. For miles in any direction, it was just me, and waters, and tall grasses, and pines, and blue skies. At least, that's what I thought. I was spending the night staring at the moon. There's something about it that's hypnotic and mesmerizing. I would then stare at the water. I would then see disturbances in the water. At the time, I just attributed this to the fish, which made me look forward to the catches during the day. But there were some things about the disturbance in the water that I could not account for. Protrusions above the water that didn't belong to any fish that I knew of. And believe me, if anyone knew fish, it was me. In the middle of one night, I woke up by virtue of some deep down instinct. I was in trouble, but I couldn't have told you why. I consciously stepped out of my tent and looked around. I didn't see any wolves or coyotes or bears, but when I looked towards the water, I saw some hunchback shape with a long tail. I could make out the silhouette of long claws, a spiked dorsal plate that ran up and down the back all the way to the tip of the tail. At first, I gasped, thinking this was a real-life dinosaur that was probably hunting at night, and would make sense since they were nocturnal. The movement of the water seemed very strange. That's when I realized that I was looking at more than one of the same creature, perhaps dozens. They were pacing at the edge of the water. Each time I got something like a clear glimpse of their heads, they were turned toward me. I had a sinking sensation in my stomach as I was aware of the vast empty miles of wilderness that surrounded me. I could run for hours and not even see a single soul. I was alone out there with these things that were very much aware of me. Safe to say, I didn't sleep much the rest of that trip. A few of those nights I didn't sleep at all, and the times that I did sleep, it was out of sheer exhaustion. I don't know why those dinosaur creatures never bothered to engage me. Maybe they were just guarding something, and they were making sure that this human being wasn't going any further. Either way, I still see those shapes stalking me in my sleep, circling me like sharks. But that's probably my own fear and trauma of the experience. To this day, I honestly believe I saw real-life dinosaurs. I was driving home one afternoon through some thick farmland, admiring the open fields, and thinking to myself how lucky I was to be able to have a steady job in the town and then come home to my house out in the countryside. It was a glorious springtime day when the sun was just about still shining and the trees were starting to look green and healthy again. I was just enjoying looking around and taking in the sights when I saw something run out in front of me onto the road. I never travel too fast for this very reason on the windy roads, as you never know what might spring out of the hedges, and I have had a near miss with a deer before, in which I'm still not sure of which was more startled. This thing was far enough in front of me for me to be able to apply the brakes carefully and ease my already low speed without causing any issues. There were no other cars about anyway. This also gave me the chance to be able to see what type of creature this particular jaywalker was. It was some sort of lizard reptile. That much I do know. And if I hadn't seen it with my own two eyes, I never would have even believed it was there. That would be because of the greenish scales covering its body. Where something like that had come from or was heading off to, I have no idea. There is water around here, but not exactly huge lakes or swamps. Still, it was there, crossing the road. A reptile of which I had never seen the like before. You see, unless most of its kin, it wasn't slithering across the road, or scampering on four little feet like a gecko. No, this creature was strolling across the road on 2 feet. Upright, like a person. It appeared to have tiny legs and webbed feet, a long scaly body, and even tiny arms. It almost looked like a lizard, or an alligator had just decided that 2 feet would be the way to go. Its body looked all wrong. Not that there was anything even remotely normal about what I was seeing. It was more like a human torso, but covered in green scales with reptilian limbs. And then was the head. Have you ever seen the creature from the Black Lagoon? That odd-shaped head, with like flat gills on the side. Well, that was what it was on top of this messed up long human lizard. It wasn't that tall either, maybe 3 feet at most. Once it clocked the car, it turned and stared at me for a moment. Bug-wide eyes, never blinking. Then it sped off faster than I never would have thought. I sat there, my car idling, wondering what on earth I had just seen. It didn't appear threatening, and I wasn't exactly scared. More in awe and disbelief. After a few moments, when it seemed I wouldn't be making a return journey, I simply carried on my way home. But I'll never exactly forget what I saw that evening. A few years ago, I was on my way back from a work conference when I began to feel really tired. I know myself well enough to recognize that I needed a break and to try and catch a few Z's before I fell asleep at the wheel. So I pulled over the road into a lay-by and just closed my eyes. I must have needed it, as the next thing I know, I jolted awake and checked my phone. I'd been out for nearly 3 hours, and now the sun was beginning to rise. Now it was brighter, and I could see that I had parked very close to some water. A lake or a reservoir, maybe. I decided to get out of the car, just for a minute or two, for a quick stretch, as my legs were all pins and needles, and I had a crick in my neck from not sleeping properly. As I got out, I noticed the car had some footprints. It wasn't hard to notice as the paint job is white, and the prints were muddy. But there was something unusual about them. They were spaced out, as if whatever had taken a walk straight over my car had been on 2 legs, and even more bizarre, had webbed feet. For a moment, I thought about maybe a goose, as they have 2 legs and webbed feet. But on closer inspection, although I am no expert on the size of bird feet, these prints looked much bigger, as if a man-sized web-foot creature had used my car as a bridge. The footprints were also pointed towards the water, so whatever had gone over the car had more or less plunged straight in. I could then also see that there was a large puddle on the roadside where the footprints began. I stared out into the water for ages, trying to make sense of it. But no matter what, I just couldn't come up with a reasonable explanation as to why I had a man-sized lizard footprint on my car that just disappeared into the water. So, I listened to YouTube channels for a while, and I found yours. And you seem to know a lot of stuff about this particular subject. Would you mind sharing some helpful advice? Dogs can be a blessing and a curse. They are great when they come and lovingly wag their tail, and they are fun when you needed an excuse to get off your butt and go for a walk. They are not so great when they need to go out at 10 p.m., when it is cold, dark, and pouring rain, especially when they need to go, and they've been trained not to poop in the yard. So that was why on a cold, wet, dark night, I found myself in the woods behind the house, cursing my dog who seemed to be constipated by the amount of time he was taking to find a decent spot. I stood there, stomping my feet and blowing on my hands trying to keep warm, trying not to notice the rain trickling down on the back of my jacket, when I heard some rustling in the trees, not on the side where the dog was though. After all, we were the ones trespassing at the time, which is why I wasn't worried. The nocturnal creatures were ready to come out and play, and the last thing they needed was to see a human and a huge dog that wouldn't make up its mind where to squat. There was a sort of wet hissing noise. I know that sounds like an odd way to describe it, but that was what it was. A bit like when you go swimming and swallow too much water. More rustling and shaking of leaves, and I shouted at the dog to hurry up, or I was leaving him there all night on his own. Not that he understood or cared, but it's what we do. More rustling, and for the first time, I noticed that the rustling wasn't coming from the ground by around. It was the same height as around me in the trees. I thought it was odd, sure. It could have been a squirrel, but wouldn't they have been much higher up? And then it stepped out. The first thing I thought was that it must be some kind of kid dressed up. It was too late to be alone in the woods, and Halloween wasn't for ages away. But as I was just good staring at it, I began to think that if it was costume or makeup, it was Hollywood-level special effects. From its feet to its head, it was covered in what looked to me, because of the poor lighting, brown, scaly skin. It was just a bit taller than me, and skinny as a rake, with long dangly arms and long legs like a supermodel would have. I didn't know if it was male or female. The torso was just flat, and I couldn't see any parts to give it a sex. Then was the head. It was flat and long, not round or oval like a person, but squat like an actual snake, with eyes on either side, and huge lidless eyes. The dog noticed too, letting out a noise, followed by a whimper, while running over to me. That was enough to frighten off this snake, and it kind of slithered off. I don't know how it could have slithered. It had long legs, but that's what the movement reminded me of. The dog began barking frantically, and tried to chase this thing. I was able to grab him and pull him back to the house. He was at my heels when we got inside. He whined and begged, and acted crazy for a while. Now I can't drag him into those woods when it's dark. I can't have imagined it. If the dog saw it too, that must mean we really did see something out there that we can't explain. I'm pretty confident, what lurks beneath, that I am not hallucinating. What are your thoughts on my encounter? I am very proud of my Native American heritage, and have dedicated many of my years to researching as much as I can about my grandparents and their amazing folklore and stories. Tons of incredible legends live and breathe. A lot of it is downright fascinating, but some is absolutely terrifying. Thankfully, I have yet to find anybody who has had real-life experiences with a Wendigo, and to be honest, I hope to hell that I never do. But another creature that is giving me many sleepless nights after researching it is something called the pukwudgie. Now, you might be asking, why would a tiny, mythical woodland spirit scare me so much? Well, the reason is that, unlike the Wendigo, I have a first-person encounter story, and the person who saw it was my grandfather. Now, my grandparents grew up on the res, back before they moved into the city, where my mom was eventually born. My grandfather recalls spending hours as a kid, playing in the beautiful surrounding woodland. It was much simpler times, and without the technology that is just second nature to children these days, they would have to entertain themselves for hours on end, with nothing but the woods and sticks, sometimes building forts, sometimes playing hide-and-go-seek, and other times, children would be left to explore the great outdoors, as it should be. Most kids, however, found themselves playing hide-and-go-seek. They'd split into teams and run off into the woods. My granddad held the record for being the longest, and he wasn't about to let that slide into somebody else's hands. Running as fast as he could, he managed to cover a surprising amount of ground before he could no longer hear the shouts of 99, 100, coming, ready or not. He'd ended up in a fairly densely covered area, and was happy it would take a while to be discovered. Backing into the undergrowth, he was almost entirely covered in foliage. Boy, was he happy, he tells me. One by one, he could hear the calls and shouts of others being found, and it was hard not to laugh or even call out with glee. He was well on his way to a new record. That was for sure. But that changed when he heard a noise. To start with, he naturally presumed he was about to be discovered by another kid. So, he crouched down even further, hoping they'd walk past him without spotting him. He could still hear the sounds of his buddies running and the occasional "gotcha" from afar, and he began to try and work out which of the voices from the seeking team he couldn't place. Once he heard all three calling to the others, he figured he must have been joined by a nosy rabbit or something. He wasn't at all scared at this point, just hoped the critter didn't give him away. More snuffling and crunching followed, much to his annoyance. He had the perfect hiding spot and was about to be outed by a rabbit. He was also doing his damnedest to not sneeze, despite not being able to see a flower anywhere. There was a really strong floral scent, which was making his nose itch like crazy. And that was when he saw him. Now, I need you to bear in mind something. My grandfather was, 1, just a small boy at the time, and 2, crouched on the floor. This him that appeared barely came up to his eye level, but being short was the only unusual thing about him. The small man appeared to be gray in color, and his back and the top of his head were covered in spikes, like a porcupine. He had beady little black eyes, a large bulbous nose, and a sinister grin on his large oversized mouth. And my granddad knew exactly what this ominous little creature was. A pukwudgie. And he was petrified. You see, he had been told that if you ever encountered one of these creatures, you had to be extremely careful. If you made one wrong move and made them angry, they could and will kill you. And you wouldn't even be free after that tragedy. They would keep control of your spirit for an eternity. Needless to say, my granddad did what any terrified kid would do in that situation. He began to break down and cry. He was terrified, and just this mere presence would be enough for the creature to curse him. He burst into tears. He'll never know if that act was enough to appease this creature, that somehow, by displaying that level of fear and submersion, he had awarded the creature some sort of respect. But the little gray man looked at him. That awful grin, still plastered on his face, simply disappeared. Poof into the air, gone. Too frightened to move, my grandfather stayed there for another 10 minutes or so until his buddies found him. At first, they thought he must have been hurt. Discovering your friend, sobbing, with tears and snot all over your face, curled up on the floor was not what they were expecting. Having managed to calm him down enough to ascertain he wasn't physically injured, they took him home. Only in the sanctum of his own 4 walls did he finally feel brave enough to recount what exactly happened. His friends listened in awe, whilst his parents exchanged knowing and worried looks. Thankfully, nothing more came of the encounter, and he had not been cursed or attracted the creature to continue to play tricks on him. It took a long time for any of the kids to go back into those woods, but they never saw him again. I love listening to your stories, and I will bet you that most others tuning into this will have heard of Sasquatch, Bigfoot, you name it. But I wonder what they might make of my story, or you for that matter. In fact, It was actually around 5 years ago now that I was driving home from a long evening shift. You see, I had my own experience with something that I can't explain, and I think it was something other than a Sasquatch. It's very typical. These stories always seem to happen at night, with no one else around to verify it. But I guess that's why so many of these things exist and haven't been hunted to extinction yet. So, there I am, minding my own business and driving pretty fast, since there is barely any other cars on the road with me. I'm singing along to some rock tune on the radio, drumming my fingers on the steering wheel, headlights on full beam, as it's hella dark. I remember having to slow down as it had begun to rain. So, I hit the wipers on. Just because there was nobody else around didn't mean that I wanted to end up in a ditch. I cursed as the rain got heavier and heavier, because it was now making it even harder to see the damn road. To be fair, I'd driven this route so often, I could almost do it by memory. But you can never take the chance that a deer, or something larger, could take out your car and might just choose the exact moment to run out in front of you. And, as if by magic, that was exactly what happened. Only, if this was magic, it would be the black kind, with pentagrams and satanic vigils. I slammed on my brakes quickly, and how I didn't skid into it, I'll never know. Stopping distance in the heavy rain is a lot more than when my foot hit that pedal, that's for sure. The car came to a stop, literally, right in front of this thing. I say thing because there's no other accurate words to really describe this creature. At first, due to its size, I thought it must be a man. But despite this initial presumption, as the wipers cleared the windshield, and with the powerful headlights on full beam, I could clearly see whatever this thing was in no way, shape, or form a human being. Due to the dark and the artificial light from the car, I was unable to determine exactly what color its fur was. Yes, that's right. It was covered in fur, like that of a bear. But this was no bear. I think it was gray, but to be honest, it could have been a bluish hue. It was huge. Whilst I first, as I was careening towards it, it looked man-size, and now it was right in front of me. I could clearly see it was well over 6 feet, more like 7 or 8, if I had to guess, maybe more. Its head and face, well, again, it's hard to describe, as I am pretty sure my mind was desperately trying to rationalize all of it. But it looked like a wolf almost, resplendent with giant wolf-like teeth and bright yellow eyes. So, apart from the fact that there was a giant gray-blue bipedal wolf standing in front of my car, I hear your listeners shouting werewolf or dogman. Well, here's the kicker. Staring right at me, just when I thought I couldn't possibly be any more afraid, it, and I kid you not, this thing had wings. You heard me. This giant blue bipedal wolf-faced creature had wings that resembled that of a gargoyle, like what you'd see in movies. Bat-like, tears and holes in them. Disgusting. It stood its ground, staring at me through the windshield, just gawking, a blank expression. No, I didn't try anything. This thing just seemingly looked aggressive. I was afraid to make any move. So, I did the only thing that I could think of. I didn't try to run it over, but this thing, whatever I was looking at, looked strong enough to pick up the car, and I didn't think for one moment that I could harm it even if I tried to. Knowing this creature, had I rammed my car into it, I'd probably only destroy the front of my vehicle. So, I rammed my hand down on the horn and blasted it over and over, hoping for the best. When you're in a state of immense fear and panic, well, your brain kind of goes haywire. And you know what? Startling it at the time seemed to do the job, as it gave me one stare, a malevolent look, and took off. I sat there for just a moment, trying to stop my hands from shaking, and then speeding off, burning whatever was left on my tires. At that moment, I didn't care about the wet roads. I just needed to haul out of there. Thankfully, I made it back in one piece, and you bet that I went straight to the fridge and downed a couple of beers. I'll never know exactly what I saw out there, but I can never forget its face. Its image, its entirety is forever burned in my mind. This is just a quick story that I'm sending you, but nevertheless, it is something that I will never forget. So please, hear me out. About 6 months ago, I was lying in bed one night, tossing and turning, and for some reason, unable to drift off to sleep. This wasn't wholly unusual when my husband, who's a cop, is on a late shift. So, I accepted that I was likely going to just lie there until I heard the key in the door. But at least I had one thing to keep me company while I waited: the baby monitor. The fact I could hear super cute gurgling from the baby and contented little snores from the toddler helped soothe me. It comforted me, even if I could not sleep when their daddy wasn't home. At least they could. As I was lying there listening, feeling thankful it was such a still night, as I could clearly hear both of them breathing, there was a sudden bang. Now, the toddler insists on sleeping surrounded by toys, so it isn't exactly unusual for them to start rolling off the bed during the nighttime, and the baby seemed to be used to it. I waited to see if there was a follow-up noise before I padded down to their room and risked disturbing their slumber. Nothing, and all was quiet, except their little cooing noises for a few minutes, and then a bang. This bang, though, was so loud that it caused all the lights on the monitor to shine. Still not concerned at this point, more like hoping to hell the toddler hadn't fallen out of bed, I headed into the room, still being quiet as a mouse. As I peered around the door, I could just make out their sleeping forms by the low beam emitted from their nightlight. Both were in bed, not that the baby could get out of the crib anyway, and both still fast asleep, although the toddler was making those that I am going to wake up mumbling sounds. I couldn't see anything on the floor when I heard the bang again. As I was now in the room, I could ascertain it was coming from the window. At this point, I was feeling a little unnerved, but more still hoping to God whatever it was didn't wake up both of my children. Tiptoeing over to the window, I moved the curtain slightly and peered out. What I saw next, I will never forget. Thank God I had closed the window that night, because the banging was caused by a hand. A large hairy hand, covered in what appeared to be thick, coarse, dark hair. Maybe it was fur. I couldn't exactly tell. And to be honest, I was so startled and frightened, I don't think it really mattered. I couldn't help myself. I screamed, and of course, woke up both the children, who began crying immediately. I grabbed them both and slammed the door, racing into my room and gathering them up close to me. I heard 3 more loud bangs on the window through the baby monitor. Then, nothing. After their initial shock, both children soon fell back asleep. The toddler next to me, and the baby fast asleep in my arms. That's how my husband found us, just a couple of hours later after he finished his shift. Being a police officer, he grabbed his flashlight and gun and made a very thorough check of the inside and outside of the property. Coming back inside, he made sure everything was locked up and suggested that I try and get some good earned rest. I am not entirely sure that he believed that I had seen a hairy, clawed hand scratching at the window, trying to get in. He is far more used to dealing with human monsters. Oh, and there's one more thing. We live in an apartment building on the 8th floor, and there's nothing outside the window except air. So what the hell did we see exactly? I'll never know. I guess this story begins when I was out for my morning run. I came across a flyer stapled to one of the telephone poles that actually looked recent. Nobody really put things up on these old splintered posts, at least around here. It was the work of distraught parents that weren't content to let law enforcement handle things on their own. It was a notice of a missing little girl from our area, written very strangely. I saw the official missing poster at the post office. The writing, much more tame. I felt for the people involved. I honestly did. The distress they were in was palpable, even to me, and I had never even met the family. The child was something out of a storybook. Blonde hair and blue eyes, pictured in a set of pink overalls with a white heart in the center. Soon enough, though, I couldn't take 3 steps without seeing or hearing something related to the supposed kidnapping. I tried not to think about it while I was out for my morning jog. I don't mean to be cold. I just have to have a span of time where the world's poison isn't on my mind. So, when I came home later, I found something on my front doorstep. A large teddy bear, the kind that would never fit in a household washer. I looked it over, and there was no sign of who it came from or where it came from. I just wondered if it had been delivered by mistake. I noticed that it was hardly new. It was old and didn't smell pleasant. I couldn't think of who hated me enough to cart a heavy, musty, plush teddy bear onto my front step. But a new thought chilled me. Did they know my morning routine and thus know when to drop the bear off when I wasn't around? Then, I speculated that I was being watched. It was a horrible feeling, and I brushed it off. So, I dragged the smelly thing out by the trash bin for the next morning pickup. 1 minute, the garbage truck was there. The next, it was gone. And so was the darn bear. I had uneasy dreams that night. Something dark had burrowed into my sleeping mind. I was dreaming about crying coming from somewhere inside the house, and I couldn't find it, no matter how I searched. And it was getting louder, and I was afraid that I would get the attention of the neighbors, leading them to suspect that I was guilty of something. I awoke in a cold sweat to find that the crying was indeed no dream. It was soft, but real, and very much so present. I couldn't find where it was coming from, and I fought back a tide of panic, telling myself that there had to have been some rational explanation. So, I walked into my bedroom for the 5th time and froze when I finally noticed the window. There was the bear, before me, staring in. I lost myself for a moment, the terror finally overriding all my senses. I thought to call the police, but what would I tell them? There was a bear in my window? The crying was coming from the bear. I steeled myself, thinking that this was one of those toys that recorded sounds and plays them back. Surely, this was just a trick. When I stepped outside with the bear, the crying had ceased completely. I was shaking, and it wasn't from the rain. I gave the bear a good frisking, and it did seem to have some weight inside of it that wasn't meant to be there. Maybe the make of the recording device that would tell me more. The bear was already cut open, the folds seamlessly pressing together. Something that smelled awful welled up into my face as I reached inside. The source was the decomposing body of a little girl who went missing, wearing the exact same pink overalls that I'd seen in the poster. Hi, I may not even be submitting this story to the right podcast. You seem to deal with all things monsters. I dealt with a real monster a few years back when I was only 8 years old. I'm 14 now. My mother loves thrift and resale shops. Whenever she goes, she has to take me along, for some reason. I get it, that cheap stuff is cool, but how much stuff does anybody really need? Just because it's cheap doesn't mean you have to buy it. But anyway, she gave me the usual line of it. If I go with her this time, she'll get me anything I wanted. I was 8. It wasn't like I could refuse and stay home by myself, which, in hindsight, would have been nice. So, I'm dragged to yet another resale shop. They more or less knew my mom by name there. She went straight for the clothes, while I found my way over to the toys. Something caught my eye. It was a magic 8-ball in the hands of a plush old-fashioned clown. To my delight, the clown was attached to an 8-ball by magnets. I had always wanted a magic 8-ball, and here I would get a cool clown doll along with it. For once, I was happy to be along for one of my mom's thrift binges. I played with the 8-ball often, and put it back in the hands of the clown when I was done. In fact, I named him Herman. One night, I was having fun with the 8-ball rather late, asking it questions and shaking it under the covers by the light of my useless track phone. I froze in place when I heard some sort of shuffling in my room. It didn't sound like a full-grown person was around, but it didn't sound like an animal either. I couldn't place it, so I stayed under the covers and waited. I tried to lighten things up a bit, and I silently asked the 8-ball if the noise was Herman. It showed up as yes, definitely. I fought off a shiver and forced a smile. I again asked if it was Herman, and he was looking for me in particular. It repeated its previous answer. I asked if Herman knew where I was, and it said, very doubtful. Then, I asked what Herman wanted, since I knew it could only answer yes or no, or so I thought. It said, better not tell you now. And if you don't believe me, Google it. It's an actual answer on some makes of 8-balls. I began trembling, and I had to fight it off. I asked the 8-ball if Herman was going to hurt me, and it said, it is certain. No, this was getting far too strange. Surely it wouldn't answer the same question twice. I asked it, has Herman found me yet? And it answered, it is decidedly so. I threw off my covers so that I could turn on my bedroom light. When I did, I totally lost it, since Herman was sitting on the foot of my bed, but facing me where I was at the light switch. My parents came to my rescue. They naturally wrote the whole thing off as a bad dream, and I promptly threw away Herman and the 8-ball, and I never bothered to replace either one of them. Well, the story gets even more interesting as time had gone on. See, I kind of forgot about the whole Herman thing, until a few years later, I guess I found out that there was a rather large group of gypsies who had been donating many of the items and toys to that same thrift store that my mother went to. If you know anything about gypsies and their culture, they are heavily involved in maybe not necessarily witchcraft, like black masses and killing children, but they do practice voodoo and magic to an extent. So, I almost wonder if maybe somehow, being around that culture, there was a demon that had found its way inside that Herman doll in traditional horror movie fashion. I don't know. That was real enough for me. What I dealt with inside that doll was a real living entity. What exactly was its purpose? I'm not sure, but it seemed intent on wanting to hurt me. Please excuse my lack of knowledge, which is why I'm coming to you with questions. Which I should ask you, if there is such a thing as a shadow cryptid. I call it that because I don't know what else to refer to it as. I had a very recent experience with one of these shadow cryptids, and it's just crazy enough to be worth sharing. So I checked into a cheap, single-story hotel during a business trip I was on. I was dog-tired, and staying on the road just wasn't an option if I wanted to survive. I was in bed, lights out, when I heard movement somewhere. It seemed to be where I had hung up my hat and coat next to the door. I thought that maybe a rat or something had gotten in my room and was going to chew holes in my good coat. Moonlight was now streaming in and throwing a huge white square on the just spot I suspected the sounds to be coming from. And I didn't see any rodents. But I did see movement. I shouted on instinct, "Hey!" A slithering shape withdrew and rose up to briefly take the shape of a person before melting into something like a pool of ink, and then finally snaking out of my room through the crack underneath the door. I pinched myself to make sure that I wasn't asleep and dreaming. I got up, and against my better judgment, to check out what I had just seen. Opening the hotel room door, I stepped into the hallway and looked around. I saw it, slithering there on the floor. It stretched out like a sheet of dried black rubber into the shape of a person, yet again. A single red eye blinked at me a few times. Once again, it collapsed into a puddle and began racing away very quickly. I couldn't tell you for all the money in the world why I decided to chase after it. I was more interested than terrified. It was just too crazy. And I probably sound crazy for not ducking back into my room and staying there. I chased it, but it had no trouble of staying ahead of me. Soon, I became winded, developed a side stitch, but I wasn't catching up. I also started to realize that the hallway seemed awfully long for a place that small. In the moonlight, I could easily read the numbers on the doors. They were repeating. By virtue of some nightmare law come true, I was running through the same repeating segment of hallway, over and over again. It was when I realized this that I think I heard some laughter from the shadow up ahead, except it sounded very deep in pitch and distorted, kind of like somebody playing a recording of a laughter, pitch shifted, and played through a loudspeaker. I gave up the chase before I fell over unconscious. The simple act of turning the opposite direction brought me right back to my room. I overslept, waking up way too late to depart on time properly. I don't know if this was a fever dream or what. I tried to dig up some information on beings called shadow people, but here, the resemblance is very marginal. I get sick when I come near small, single-story hotels that look like they could have a history. So, I'm sending this to you, in hopes you can maybe debunk what exactly I had an encounter with. Because I know, for sure, this wasn't a dream. I did come in contact with something evil. Hi. Me and my twin sister have a story for you about a living shadow that used to give us trouble. We're identical twins. She looks like me, and I look just like her. We were staying with my grandmother for an extended period due to fire damage to our house. My grandmother took care of us, while my mother and father saw to getting our home back and up and running as soon as possible, however long that would take. I don't even remember what woke me up at night, but I had come to just in time to see my sister floating through the air. I thought that surely grandmother was carrying her, and I just couldn't see her for some reason. When my sleeping sister floated across the open window, I could see that she was being held by some kind of being of shadow. I didn't think. I automatically yelled out at the thing to put my sister down and leave her alone. This thing, whatever it was, jumped as if it had honestly been startled. My sister landed on the foot of my bed and didn't awake from her sleep. I was worried that she was hurt, but she wasn't. She actually slept through the entire thing. I thought that was the end of that. Well, it wasn't. I dreamt the very next night about being a small infant and being in the arms of some adult that I could not see the face of. I felt warm and safe, and even drowsy, at least until I woke up. I wasn't in my bed. I was floating through the air, feeling a cold grasp around my body. I struggled and fought. I tried to scream but couldn't. Something chilly and strong covered my mouth. At last, I fell to the floor with a hard thud, even though my heart was pounding. I could not think of anything else to do but find my way back to bed. This repeated every single night. I would wake up as I was being carried out of my bed by the shadow that tried to carry off my sister. I woke up a little later each time, and after about a week, I could tell that it was carrying me towards the cellar staircase at the far end of the house. I tried telling my grandmother about it, but she didn't seem to comprehend what I even spoke to her. I didn't know what to do. By stopping it from carrying off my sister, I must have angered it, since it only bothered with me from then on out. The night before our parents came to get us back for good, I had woken up just outside the cellar door at the bottom of the staircase. Mother and father weren't a minute too soon. I was okay, and I wasn't. I was fine, and I was traumatized. Thinking about the whole thing was like reflecting on a dream, and yet no dream ever made me shiver that much. I'm fairly certain this was some sort of poltergeist. Last winter, I did a coffee roast in class. It seemed like such a great idea at the time. Meeting new people, learning something new, getting to try my very own coffee. The course was held in London, near Ealing, in a kitchen at the top of a block of flats. It wasn't a bad location, but it was a pretty rundown building. I was attending with one of my girlfriends, and we were both very excited. It's been months since the class, but I still can't quite comprehend what happened. There are some days it doesn't feel real, like I'm living in somebody else's body. At times, it feels like someone has taken over my mind. Every day, things for me have become dark and tormenting. I can't look at children's play parks like I used to, for my innocence no longer exists. Life has become dark, wretched, scary, and even lonely. My arms are filled with icy fear coursing down my veins, and I'm constantly bumping into things and dropping things. I feel like a ticking time bomb, a myriad of stress that is heading at a rapid pace into what clearly feels like a brick wall. I used to be easygoing and airy, but lately, things have gotten worse. Ever since I saw what I saw at that class, the instructor, a Brazilian man who was very flirty with all the women, and even a bit inappropriate at times. What happened was he whispered into my ear that he needed a special favor. My stomach nodded, as I don't know what he was going to come out with. He then told me he needed me to go into the freezer and get some ice. I laughed, and he pointed me in the direction of the freezer, which was just down a corridor and next to the bathroom. It was an odd place for the freezer, and I realized that I couldn't hear any of the others in the class. So, I walked into the freezer and kept it ajar by pulling the fire extinguisher off the wall and setting it down. It was so cold. Go figure. I looked around for the bags of ice that Mario the instructor told me about. I spotted them and grabbed them and went to leave. When I closed the freezer door and put the fire extinguisher back onto the wall, I noticed a strange sound coming from one of the bedrooms. It was like a horrible grunting or groaning. Not the sound of what you would assume. It was like an animal. But there was no way this could be a domesticated pet. I've always loved animals, so I wasn't initially afraid, just curious. I continued standing there. A waft of something burning poured out into the corridor. It kind of resembled burning plastic or material. That was when I panicked, as I thought the entire place was on fire. I knew that I had no chance other to investigate, and that the owners wouldn't mind at all. I walked into what appeared to be the master bedroom, covered in blood, orange quilts, curtains, and carpet. There was an accompanying bathroom where I could hear grunts and groans, and even smoke. What the hell was going on? I threaded carefully into the bathroom, and my heart fell into my knees at the sight in front of me. It was a snake, writhing around in the bathtub, knocking over stuff, and the bathroom curtain was slightly on fire at the bottom. Only this was not a snake. This thing had two heads, one of each head of its body. It was a two-headed serpent of some kind, except again, not like you would think traditionally, but a head on each end. My mouth gaped open as I took in the horror of whatever this thing was. The creature was now gliding on the ground, up and down the bathroom poles. It was well over 8 feet. Its eyes, too, were orange and small. Little slits, which seemed to glimmer and dart around the room. I wondered what I should do. It was clearly a hazard having this animal in the house. I almost wondered if this was his pet and had escaped. Surely such a thing was a danger. I looked around and spotted an axe next to one of the fire alarms. I then contemplated about whether I should try and kill it. As if reading my thoughts, it looked over to me, dead in the eyes with both heads, and both heads opened their mouths, exposing an extremely large set of fangs and an opening where no doubt swallowed and it could devour its entire prey. It bolted towards me, and at that moment, I was able to step backwards and shut the door. I ran out of the room, back up the corridor, panting and utterly breathless. I looked backwards to see if the thing had managed to break out of the room and follow me. Thankfully, it had not. I did hear a thrashing and crashing sound, as if it was banging itself against the bathroom door, trying to get itself out. I had clearly aggravated the beast, and it did not like being disturbed. So, I managed to discreetly grab my coat and pulled my friend out before we went home, careful not to attract any attention. I had dropped the ice all over the bedroom. Mario texted me later that evening to see what happened, but I rang him back and told him all about the supposed snake. He then informed me that he didn't live at the property, but he went down to the freezer in the bedroom after and saw the ice scattered all over the ground. He then checked with the owners. They denied owning any pet, let alone a two-headed serpent. Mario then accused me of taking drugs in the freezer. My friends too thought I had lost my mind completely. Because the last year has been so crazy, I haven't really had time to fully process everything that has happened. Look, all I know is I saw something that was real, monstrous, savage, and clearly bizarre. I've booked into a counselor in hopes that they can shed some light on what happened. I have also looked into two-headed snakes online, but by our reports, the kind I saw only exist in mythology. I hope that my account can shed some light and hopefully attract some media attention, so maybe others who have had similar experiences can come forward and not being afraid of being cast off as crazy. Even though my story sounds hokey or even crazy by many, I stand by it firmly and will gladly tell anybody about what happened. Who knows? Maybe there truly are others out there who have seen the same things that I have. When I was just a kid, I constantly found myself at my grandmother's house. I was always staying there. She was such an angel, but unfortunately, passed away back in 2014. Her house was surrounded by fields and stretches of land that seemed to go on for an eternity. This was rural Alabama, and we ran barefoot through the fields with not a care in the world. Looking back, it was such a special childhood, free from all the distractions, and very little access to screens or even technology. I felt as free as a bird on my grandmother's farm. But something happened as a child. Something disturbing, which I know I need to address as a grown woman. I believe that I encountered a real-life reptilian witch. I know I sound crazy, that if I give my name on this account, people will find me and think I have utterly lost my mind. But you don't understand. This memory has been stored in my mind and deep in my soul for well over 20 years now, and I feel like it's the time to discuss it. So, going back in time to the springtime of 1998, I want to say late April, or perhaps early May. I would have been around 9 years old. Grandmother's house was surrounded by large fields, as I said, and on this particular day, I was going down to the apple tree, as she wanted to bake us some apple pie. So, I was running down to the apple tree and climbed up on the branches. The apples were green, and as I took a big bite, they tasted of spring. I filled my basket and got ready to take them back to my grandmother's house. I heard a chirping behind me. It was the most bizarre thing. I turned around, but could see nothing. Then the chirping happened and started up again. I turned around. Still, nothing was there except the stretches of long green grass. When I turned back to grab my basket, there was a scaly hand touching one of the apples. It was green and scaly and snake-like. I shuddered and looked up. Before me was this god-awful demonic-looking thing. The only way I could describe it was skeletal, and it was wrapped in long black shawl. Whether it was a man or woman, I could not tell. Its eyes were open, bloodshot and yellow, fixed on me without blinking. The head was totally bald, showing scaly reptile-like skin and face, but almost like it was rotted away. There almost appeared to be little worms under its skin. The teeth were rotten and fang-like, and its skin was dark green to deathly pale. I tried to move back, but this creature, whatever it was fixed its hand on me, and seemed to almost rock back and forth as it attempted to pull me closer. I had no idea what it was going to do. Perhaps eat me, kill me, kidnap me. I had no idea. From the creature's head, 4 large purple horns shot up, and this creature continued to grab me and hold me with a viciousness and savagery. I closed my eyes and prepared myself to die. When it wanted me, I was not sure. The next thing I remember, it released its grip from me and retreated into the bushes before disappearing. My hands were bleeding, and I had a large wound. I looked up to the hill and could see my grandmother staring down at me. She ran to hold me. I began crying and started to explain to her what had happened. She told me she saw it all. We went back to her house, and she told me a very similar thing had happened when she was a little girl. It was deeply traumatic. She told me this, and she never quite got over it. Grandmother and I would talk about the incident for many years to come, right up until her passing. We both never veered that we saw something supernatural, demonic, and terrifying. At times, this creature still appears in my nightmares, and I wake up imagining its scaly hand locked over mine. I still have a car where it struck its force into my childish hands. I am writing this now, many years after the incident, and I hope that somebody else can come forward and tell me they have maybe seen something similar. At my grandmother's funeral, we also baked an apple pie in her honor. I went up to the attic and had the urge to look out at the old tree, now neglected with age. You wouldn't believe this, but I could have swore that I saw the same strange figure submerged at the bottom of the trunk. I just shuddered and walked away, not wanting to see any more, and hoping that I wasn't truly seeing the horrors of my past. I am lucky I survived. I hope that I can connect with anybody else who has seen something that they can't necessarily comprehend. I hope my description is thorough enough. Like I said, the best way for me to accurately paint it is it was half reptile, half human, but it looked dead and skeletal, with patches of flesh missing, and what appeared to be little bugs under its skin. It's like it was a living dead creature of some kind. It was terrifying. What happened to me as a child vividly lives on in my memory. I know it was real. It still reaps trauma into my everyday life, even as I write this. Back in the early 70s, I saw something that I will never be able to fully understand and will certainly never forget. I was just a teen at the time, and even now, I can still vividly see him. Growing up on the Jersey Shore, we spent a lot of our time on the beaches and in the water. There would be an occasional shark sighting now and again, and the beaches would be closed off. But it never lasted for long, and certainly on the stretch of beach we frequented, there weren't any actual attacks. Of course, that didn't mean that the sharks weren't out there, or that they weren't killing other things in the ocean. And sometimes, we'd run down to the shore after school let out, and find all sorts of half-eaten creatures that had washed up after Sharky had finished with their snack. Being teens, we were more morbidly fascinated rather than grossed out by it. It was often more a case of what was the sickest looking thing we could find. And I'm pretty sure the octopus that washed up with each of its tentacles bitten off halfway was one of the closest times I came to losing my lunch. But despite all of this, we never actually ever saw a shark. I wish we had, because what we did see one day, back in the early 70s, was way more frightening than any great white shark. And to this day, I have no idea exactly what it was. It was the end of summer, and it was evening time. Now, you may well have gotten an image in your head of the boardwalk, and the places in Jersey which are heaving with tourists, and I apologize if I was misleading, as this particular area I'm referring to, where we used to hang out, wasn't so much private, but it was a bit more off the beaten track, so only locals tended to visit, which was fine by us, as oftentimes it was just there. Anyway, so, it was late summer, late evening, but not yet night, so it was getting dark, but we could still see okay. And what we saw, I'm just gonna come out and say it. We saw a gator man, or as I describe it later on, because we're not the only people to see this thing. A humanoid alligator. I was real grateful. I had some buddies with me at the time. Not just because it scared the crap out of me, but so I could prove I wasn't lying or hallucinating or something. After all, it was the 70s, so I'm pretty sure a lot of people were still using acid or smoking weed. But to be clear, we were not. In fact, we were all sober, and had been. Hell, my dad was a cop. He'd have beaten me black and blue if I ever did a drug. So, there were 4 of us, all completely sober, and we all saw this gator man. The best way I can describe him is he looked like a real tall alligator. Like, instead of having those tiny squat little limbs, so it looks like they're wandering about on their belly, it had arms and legs, the size and length of a person, but still covered in scales with claws, and a full of gator head with that long snout and huge teeth. It had reared up out of nowhere, in the ocean, but close enough for us to be able to see it. I think the water came up to like where its knees would have been. I have no idea what it did then, or where it went off to, because you can bet your bottom dollar that we ran out of there as fast as we possibly could, and did not look back. There were quite a few sightings of him that summer, enough for us to believe that it wasn't some sort of hallucination. But then he disappeared. What he was, why he was there, I'll never know, but I'll never forget him. When I was in college, I took a road trip with my roommate back to her home in Ohio for Thanksgiving. It was a long drive, to say the least, but the promise of a week of home cooking and free laundry was more than enough to make the journey worth it. My roommate was a lot of fun, and came from a huge family, most of which I'd be meeting over the next few days. So, the trip went by fairly quickly, as she joyously told me the various stories featuring Uncle Lenny or her cousin Susie. We made sure to take plenty of rest stops and even had lunch at a mom and pop's roadside diner. We texted her mom whenever we had bars or service to let her know our progress. Things were going great. Then, we came to this strip of highway that looked like it hadn't been used in decades. It was like something straight out of a serial killer movie, and we laughed and joked about finding a broken down car on the side of the road. A Bundy-esque dude just waiting to club us over the head. Of course, since I'm writing into you to tell you the story, you know that didn't happen. Also, you talk about cryptid monsters and not humans. Anyway, whilst we were laughing and planning on how we would escape and be final girls, we did see something on the side of the road. But it was Bundy or BTK, obviously. This thing seemed much smaller than a person to start with. And as we got closer, at first, we presumed to be it was some kind of dog. I don't know why, to be honest, because even as we were approaching it, I could tell that it appeared to be a greenish color, and dogs don't tend to be that sort of shade. It also appears to stand up, because we could see legs. So, and we still are a little bit away. It looks like we are approaching something smallish, maybe around 4 feet tall, standing upright on 2 legs, and green. I can very distinctly remember that as we drove past it, as we were literally eye to eye looking at it out of the passenger window. Neither of us said a word. We were both completely silent for a good 5 to 10 minutes afterwards. My roomie did not slow down at all, but she didn't speed up either. We just kept rolling. Finally, I do remember folding my hands onto my lap and staring straight ahead out the windshield. Not looking at my buddy, I simply said, "Did you just see that really tall frog standing up like a person?" She then burst out in what seemed like a relieved laughter and exclaimed yes. We both had a nervous laugh for a bit, and to be honest, I'm not too sure that either of us could fully quite comprehend exactly what we had just driven past. I mean, it's not exactly an everyday occurrence to see Mr. Toad from Wind in the Willows stood by the side of the road, is it? Of course, this guy wasn't dressed in clothes. That would be ridiculous. But he was like the size of a human child, and he was most definitely upright, on 2 bowed legs, not crouched down, ready to jump on all 4, like a regular frog would. It honestly went through my mind that maybe we had been poisoned or drugged by the coffee at the diner, because it couldn't possibly be real. But if we were, then we showed no other signs or symptoms. So what the hell did we see? Is there really a species of tall 2-legged frogs roaming the highways out here in Ohio? Was he trying to hitchhike? We'll never know. But we still often think about that frogman and what he is up to these days. I mean, after all, I think there was a pretty large swamp or marshland nearby. Either way, we try to make jokes about it, but it's still freaky because we both saw the exact same thing. I work in the mailroom for a huge corporate business. The hours are long, tedious, and repetitive, but the paycheck is good, and the company I am down there, even better. To keep ourselves from going mad, we often tell each other stories. Since we're all over 18, we will often try and freak each other out. Despite the business being worth millions, the mailroom is still a bit of a throwback, and although our working area is fine, and the break room and bathrooms are clean, there are still a few old, dark, and dingy storage areas down there. I see myself as a bit of a master storyteller, and had been busy memorizing a much long creepypasta as I could find to keep the mantle of King of Creepy going as I possibly could. Urban legends, crappy remakes and sequels to movies that no one had ever watched, so they didn't know how the plotline went. I loved it. As soon as my shift started, I had people begging me to tell them more and more spooky stuff. So, in a way, it was typical that what happened down in one of those dark, damp, and dingy storerooms happened to me, as literally no one believed me. They all thought it was just another one of my stories, or that I was setting them up for a prank. But I wasn't. As I have already mentioned, the actual warehouse part where we spent most of our time, and the parts of the building that we used for breaks, was absolutely fine, and had been fitted out with damp proofing, AC in the summer, heaters in the winter. But, shut away down various old corridors, was the oldest part of the building, where you only went once in a blue moon if you needed something specific. And it just so happened that a fuse had blown in the plug for the microwave, and, me being me, volunteered to head down to one of the rooms designated as a random storage, as I was sure that I had seen a box of batteries and other stuff down there. It had been raining non-stop for the last week or so, and it smelled even damper than usual the further I headed. There was obviously electricity down there, and lighting, just no heat, so it always smelled kind of rusty and a thick must. The walls even felt damp sometimes. The closer I got to the room, I thought that I could hear a sort of snuffling noise. I'm sure by now you figured I probably don't scare easy, but I still didn't want to come face to face with a rat, since they carry all sorts of nasty diseases. So, although not scared, I had my guard up, just in case. I did have my favorite work boots on, and I was a mean kicker, especially during school football. The noise got louder as I approached the door of the storeroom. It almost sounded wet, like something swallowing. It's really hard to describe. I threw open the door, my leg out in front of me, ready to kick or stomp on something. I don't know. It just felt like I needed to be ready for something. I pulled on the cord for the light, and the moment the room was illuminated, I saw it. And I will tell you exactly what I saw the best that I can. It was big. Not as big as me. But then, I'm only 6'4", and not many people are. But I figured it was easily over 5 feet. Whatever this was standing upright, on 2 legs just like you or me. It had very tiny arms that it held in front of itself. Not long, except it was at the side. It was very dark green, grainy looking, and scaly. I can 100% say that it looked lizard-like, because it had a very lizard head and face. It had a very long lizard mouth, and even a nose that looked very lizardy. Big, bugged-out yellow eyes on either side of its huge face. It looked freaky, but not necessarily fierce. This thing stood about 15 feet away from me, and was a small man-sized 2-footed lizard. I was convinced I was looking at some sort of alien, some sort of lizard alien. It looked at me, and I looked at him, or her, or it. It was androgynous. I'm saying him. I have no damn idea what sex it was. I slowly backed out and slammed the door. I ran back to the mailroom and told the others what I'd seen. I was met with an eruption of laughter, clapped them on my back, and offered high fives. A couple of them said they believed me, and came back down to the room to see for themselves. But of course, nothing. So it went down as a great prank. Another super story. Only I know what I saw. How it got down there, I have no idea. I know there are old windows on the far side of that storage room that could easily fit a large person through. But those haven't been messed with in a long time. And there are thick forest and woods surrounding the outside of this unit. Who knows? Do I really believe this thing came through the window and was stalking and waiting for the right time in that room? Not really. But I can't think of another reason why this thing was there. My granddad was a sailor, and he used to tell us all sorts of crazy stuff that he saw in the sea. In fact, a lot of the time, he would have a twinkle in his eye and the ghost of a smile as he told us, like the time he supposedly met Blackbeard the pirate, or discovered an underwater city of gold. But there was one story that no matter how many times he retold it, I never saw that twinkle. And that makes me think of the stuff he used to make up to entertain us. This particular tale was true, to my belief. They were somewhere near the Caribbean when it happened. Now, before anybody jumps to conclusions, my grandfather has now been dead for at least 20 years. I heard this story when I was around 10, so that's 30 years ago, and it happened when he was younger than I am now. So he was not inspired by or retelling of a famous movie featuring Jack Sparrow. He and the crew had been aboard the ship for around a week or so, and everything was going well. They were well on track for whatever their end destination was, and in good spirits. Most of the men at the time were below deck, doing what sailors do. That's when a large splash was heard. A very large splash. Not remotely unusual when you're in the middle of the ocean, of course. But something told him to look out over the side of the ship. At first, he couldn't see what manner of creature was responsible for the sound, but he could see ripples in the water below. He seemed to recall it was around dusk, so although the blazing sun wasn't high in the sky, it was by no means completely dark yet. He also wasn't in the slightest bit frightened, merely curious, as if it were somehow playing with him. The creature refused to come back up to the surface whilst he was watching. He could see bubbles, so he knew something was down there. A lot of the sea life he had encountered were quite nosy, and he'd seen many dolphins, and even an octopus come right up to the ship, as if to say, "What are you doing in my ocean?" Knowing these things can be playful, he stepped back from the side of the ship, so his sightline of the water was obscured. And sure enough, as soon as he had moved back, he heard two loud splashes again, and a bang, and something bumped up against the bottom of the ship. Still not thinking it was anything that would be a potential threat, he raced back over to try and catch a glimpse. And he was rewarded by catching sight of the very end of a vibrant aqua green tail fin diving back under the water. He remembers thinking that it was the most beautiful color, and also, what on earth must be the fish that the tail fin was on? By now, his curiosity had peaked, but was still not afraid. Backing away slowly, he made sure he was out of sight. But this time, he crept quietly to the edge of the ship so that could pop up instantly and see what was down there. Maybe he discovered a new breed of fish. As I said, he was curious and now excited to see exactly what was playing hide and seek with him. He heard a bump and a splash, and this time shot up as quick as he could to look over the side. As I've said, whenever Granddad told us about meeting Long John Silver or surviving a battle with a kraken, We knew he was full of it, embellishing things to entertain us. He'd get really animated as he told us, and it often ended up with him making us jump and then smothering us in kisses. But I swear, when he told us this, there was none of that. If you can believe it, he actually paled, and there was a slight tremor to his voice. That was because this time, when he looked over, he did catch a fleeting glance of what was playing with him. It was a mermaid. Don't be fooled for 1 second that this thing had anything in common with Ariel. The best way that he was able to describe its body was that it looked like Nosferatu, with long hair, a gnarled bony body, and a fin. Can you even imagine that? Nosferatu's twisted features with huge warped fangs, wide gaping eyes, but instead of a bald head, long straggly wet hair covered and thick in seaweed. Then, instead of a human body, the rancid, almost concave bony structure with visible ribs and 2 shriveled, wrinkled chest bones. The only thing to indicate properly that it was indeed a creature of another world. The only thing similar to the Disney film was her fin, which was indeed quite beautiful, and the scales shimmered in the setting sun. Of course, as soon as the creature realized it had been seen, it dove back under the water and never resurfaced. Granddad said of course they all knew the legends of sirens who were meant to be beautiful enchantresses who lured sailors with their beauty and song, and then usually killed them and ate them. If that had been a siren, then it must have taken a very drunk or desperate man to succumb. Whatever it was, it absolutely terrified my father and my granddad. He never saw anything like it again. But a year or so after that, he stopped sailing permanently and swore to always stay on land from then on out. Thanks for hearing my story. My determination to never own a car is what ultimately led up to the building blocks of this very story. I can't afford to completely live off the grid, but I do everything I can to distance myself from life of dependence. You know, I don't use money unless I have to. I won't be caught dead using a bank. I earn only as much money as I'll have to use. Everything else I try to accomplish with my own 2 hands. The system wants to shackle these hands. Your hands too. I think it's because of the determination to resist that I ended up having this encounter in the first place. Some of the money that I can't do without is my bus fare. I will not own a vehicle, so I need to get to where I'm going with the buses that are always crawling all over Manhattan. It's not a bad way to do things. It beats being tied down to a payment and repairs and maintenance costs. Gosh, and freaking insurance. So, when you're taking the bus as often as I, you get to know the patterns of the faces of the people that you see. You get a feel for who works in the morning, or who has errands to run in the afternoon, or who the night workers are. Just for the hay of it, I began taking different buses, just to see the different crowds. It took me several runs to see it, but I began to catch on to that no matter which bus I was on, there was always one person that always was there with me. He was an old man that looked like an old woman if you didn't look close enough. He looked a little on the homeless side, a little on the mentally ill side. He looked a little on every side. A virtual human kaleidoscope with an oversized cowboy hat that's been crushed more than once. A Hawaiian shirt that was usually unbuttoned, and pink shorts and sneakers. He was always carrying some variation of paper or plastic shopping bags. He never smiled, and never really made eye contact with anyone. You'd think somebody that loud would stand out right away. But I can't describe the way he always kind of blended in with everything. I mean, he was so out there. He was ordinary. Anyway, no matter which bus I took, there was at some point a crazy idea beginning to form in the back of my head that would not be ignored. I got the notion that he was following me. So, I was going to follow him back. The first few times I tailed him, I really didn't think he was aware of me. But I've been doing things long enough to know the revelation comes with persistence. He would stay on the bus for several cycles through the route, as if it were a means of sightseeing. But then, he would get off at a stop and sit down and wait for another bus. Then, he'd ride that one through its route several times. I don't think I ever observed him stopping to use the bathroom anywhere. He just kept going. My bladder and bowels would always seem to scream before his did. Things came to a head that day, and I had finally given up and decided that he was just a derelict old man that had nothing better to do with his twilight years than surf the mass transit system the way most people of later generations surf the internet. Well, then he got off at the downtown junction, where all the routes converged at once. He got off the bus, waited for another one, got on. I kid you not, no more than 10 minutes later, a completely different bus arrived and the same guy got off, waited, got on. Either those buses did some serious moving in 10 minutes, or something else was up. I did some acid back in my younger days, and I started to wonder if those permanent tendencies towards flashbacks were a culprit. But the notion started to gel in my head that there was one of him on every single bus at any given time. The more I shadowed him, the more I watched how often the buses would trade him at the junction. That became the only viable explanation. I started going to ridiculous lengths, working longer hours so I could have more money to buy those little microcams that are so cheap nowadays. I could collect footage from different buses. I know that sounds crazy, but the way we're kept asleep and oblivious to all this stuff is even crazier. Catching on to this was just part of the way I was becoming awakened. Sure enough, he was everywhere. Nobody else was everywhere, just him. He never met himself. His movements were perfectly coordinated, so that two of him would never be seen in the same place at the same time. I couldn't think of any purpose this arrangement would serve, until it hit me while I was relocating one of my cameras. Surveillance. They were somebody's eyes and ears. It would be too obvious if it were the bus driver. Put it up to somebody that is so ordinary and so quiet that nobody gives them a second look. I felt woke in that moment. I felt empowered. I had all the footage I needed to make my case and put together like a documentary. All I needed was something involving a confrontation. Candid footage of me calling him out without giving him a chance to rehearse. I made my move at one of the times that he was at the downtown junction, very early on in the morning, when he was really the only person there. I came on strong, like I might know even more than I was letting on. His eyes roamed me up and down, like some sort of mechanical scan. I became aware of a hissing sound that coincided with his breathing. He looked me in the eyes, but then somehow looked into me. I felt invaded, like he could see me without my clothes on. My vision tunneled, and he was at the focus of it all. Then, his lips moved and made some series of syllables that I couldn't derive words from. Green scales appeared on his skin, as if they had been retracted inside of his pores or something. A long tongue even darted out between his lips and wagged at me, and he made the first facial expression I had ever seen on him. A sinister grin, revealing multiple pointed, jagged teeth. Then, I felt like I was hit in the face with a sledgehammer. I woke up underneath one of the small trees surrounding the downtown junction. I didn't know how long I was out, but it felt late. I wasn't missing anything. I had one of the cams in the breast pocket of my hoodie when he turned snake-like in front of me. I thought I was going to strike a big one in the name of woke. But when I got my cams and stuff home, they had been wiped. All footage I'd ever taken just showed white noise. What's more, all of his copies disappeared, and I never saw him or anyone like him again. I've heard about snake people being in the upper areas of business and government, but I got a serious chill thinking about what they would want by taking their game all the way down to the bottom, watching over ordinary people like me that blow in and out of the wind like litter. Are they keeping tabs on all of us that closely? And what kind of voodoo was it that knocked me out? A spoken word cut my lights out. Maybe that's how they work. Maybe that's part of how they hide in the broad daylight. They don't just blend in. They got some kind of voodoo magic going on. I don't know. Like some sort of supernatural power. Look out if you keep seeing someone familiar on public transportation. They might just be a sleeper cell, waiting, listening, watching. I remember in 5th grade, we got a substitute teacher that stayed much longer than any sub should have. She was large and loud, and the only part of her that wasn't ridiculously big was her feet. Her thighs were like freak of nature beets that had slender roots for her to walk on. We kept asking her when Mrs. Wimmer was going to come back. She would just tell us soon enough, but we lost track of how long our real teacher was absent. It had to have been weeks. One day, she told us that we're going to watch a film so amazing that we would watch it for the duration of the day, breaking only for lunch and recess. I had no idea what kind of film would run for so long. Just before she started up the film, I had to get up and use the bathroom. I should have asked for permission, but it hit me so hard that I couldn't risk a no. When I got back, the television rack was already in front of the class, and white static filled the screen. Those of you old enough to remember those days know that meant the video was starting soon. But the video never started. I stared, patiently waiting for the black leader of the first few inches of film to be read. It never did. While I was waiting, everyone in the classroom burst out into laughter. It died down. It was as if something funny had happened on the TV. It happened again. I looked into the static with confusion. There was nothing there. No sound, nothing. It was one of those screens that were rounded. Such were the old makes. In a corner, I saw a reflection of the lamp at the teacher's desk, and the teacher's face lit up by it. And the reflection, distorted all kinds of ways, was something that made me catch my breath once I worked it out. Something just as scaly and hideous as a crocodile was sitting at that desk. I whirled around to see the very human teacher sitting behind the desk, but she was looking straight at me, and the eyes I saw then were the same eyes I saw in the corner of the TV screen reflection. There was more laughter around me from everybody, and the teacher smiled, a very evil, sinister smile. I feigned illness for as long as possible, until my act fell apart. By then, Weeks later, there wasn't a classroom to go back to. One of my classmates went on to do extremely violent acts. His excuse was that the teacher had taught him both through lessons and through videos that it was the right thing to do. As far as I know, that substitute teacher was never known of. I've used Google and white pages, and all else using what little information about her I could find. It's like tracking down a ghost, or a chameleon that disappears into the background. Either way, seeing that crocodile of a person left me terrified, and I have no idea if she came from this earth, or another planet, or the pits of hell itself. All I know is that it, assuming that's what it was, disguised itself as a person because its intentions were not the same